All right, so we read about Rachel and Leah's contest for children, and then Jacob and Laban's contest for sheep. Later, we're also going to read about parable of the 10 talents and other things that are talking about essentially a contest between heaven and earth for people for the kingdom. So these are all about building a people, just from different aspects. Everybody in these stories is trying a different method for accomplishing their goals, for gaining what they want. And at the beginning of the part that we read today, Leah is, she's conceiving, she's having children, no real problem, but she's not really favored by her husband. The text says that Rachel is loved, Leah is hated. It's the same kind of idea that Jacob is loved and Esau is hated. And it doesn't really mean love and hate the way that we normally think of it. This isn't saying that Jacob despised Leah, although there might be some kind of resentment over exactly how he came to be married to Leah. But obviously he's not too upset about it because he's having children with her. It's really more that Leah is disfavored in Jacob's eyes, that he favors Rachel over Leah. And the love of her husband is the one thing that Leah really wants. And it's the one thing that she can't make happen. So she's doing the best that she can by having children and providing heirs for Jacob and growing his family. But because she's disfavored, God has blessed her. If you think about other people who are disfavored in the same way, God says, Jacob I love, but Esau I hate. And it's the same kind of thing. He favored Jacob and disfavored Esau. And this is, shown through the blessing. God chose Jacob to carry on the blessing of Abraham and to create a people for himself. He did not choose Esau for that role. But that doesn't mean that he hated Esau, that he despised him. And God actually blessed Esau. Esau became the progenitor of a number of nations, just like Jacob did. And for a long time, Jacob and Esau, the two nations that they founded, were pretty close to being equal in power and influence in the region. And they were often rivals. And the same thing is happening with Rachel and Leah. Rachel is loved by Jacob. Leah is the one who's being blessed by God with children and growing Jacob's household. And then Rachel, she has her husband's love, but she's not bearing him children. And this is the thing that she really wants. The first verse in the passage that we read, verse 31. Yahweh saw that Leah was hated. He opened her womb, but Rachel was barren. So God takes an active role in blessing Leah. Rachel, he just lets her be. He is not favoring her or disfavoring her at this moment. He's just letting nature take its course. And apparently nature at this point is not giving Rachel children. I don't know what the cause is. Scripture doesn't explain it. Jacob seems to think it's God's fault, but the text just uses an adjective for Rachel being barren and uses a verb for Leah being fertile. So God actively opened the womb of one, left the other one barren in her natural state. But then the next characters are Bilhah and Zilpah. And these are Leah and Rachel's attempt to make things happen. Kind of goes back to the same thing with Abraham and Sarah and Hagar, where there's nothing in Scripture that condemns any of these people for what they're doing, but they're acting like we know this is God's plan. He plans to create this people, and it's not happening. So what can we do to make it happen? And whether or not this is what God intended to do, God blesses them through it anyways. He uses their efforts, because their efforts, in some ways they're working to try to better themselves. Rachel is in a contest with her sister, but the contest isn't to make herself better. It's to give her husband what she wants to give him. And so even though she's working through her own means to accomplish what she knows God wants to accomplish, he blesses her through it anyways. He does give children to Bilhah, and then Leah sees this and it's like, okay, Rachel can't get the better of this contest, so she puts her handmaid into it. And God blesses this too. I don't understand it. It's complicated and it's not the way that I would do things. And then we get to the story of Reuben and the mandrakes, and it seems kind of odd. It's not magic, but it reads like they're doing magic. That's kind of what this reads like. And the same thing with Jacob and his sticks with the sheep later. It all kind of seems like they're working some kind of spell and superstition and stuff. But there's something else going on underneath the words. If you think about last week's reading and the contest between Jacob and Esau, Esau comes in from the field and he's got a problem. Jacob has a solution, and so they barter over it. Like, okay, you give me this, I'll give you that. Jacob ends up with Esau's birthright. And so Esau has given away something of extreme value for a temporary fix for today's problem. And here, Reuben comes in from the field, and he's got something valuable that Rachel wants. And so Rachel goes into a negotiation with Reuben's mother, Leah. And Rachel also has something that Leah wants. And so Leah gives up the mandrake in exchange for a temporary fix for today. She gets her husband's attention for one day and gives up this thing that promises, at least in their minds, fertility for Rachel. Except that Leah says this strange thing where she says, you've taken my husband. Will you also take my son's mandrakes? Like, well, it's just a root he found in the field. Why are you so upset about this? He can go dig up another one. But I think Reuben is Leah's firstborn. And so by normal right, he should have the blessing of the firstborn. But we know from the story later on that he screws that up and does not get it. And I can't help but think that Leah is aware of the story between Jacob and Esau and how Jacob and Rebekah schemed to make sure that Jacob got this blessing. And Leah probably thinks that Rachel is going to follow the same pattern, and she's scheming somehow to take this blessing of the firstborn away from her child and give it to her own. But Rachel doesn't have any children yet, but the mandrake could give her children. And so Leah's like, oh, you're going to have a son and try to take my son's right of the firstborn away. And I think this is her real objection, not the mandrake. But Rachel's like, well, you can have Jacob for tonight. And it's the same thing that Jacob did with Esau. Gave him what he wanted for today in order to get the blessing for later. And Leah sacrifices this too. Even if she thought the mandrake was the key to maintaining the blessing of the firstborn, she was willing to give it up for one day satisfaction. But, God works through all this too. All the scheming, all the roots and branches and all the stuff that they do. God works through it to accomplish his goals. And the next part of the story, Jacob and Laban are having a contest over sheep. And they negotiate. Jacob comes in from a field again, just like Reuben and Esau before. Except the roles are kind of reversed here. Jacob is the one that God favors, and Laban is not. Laban has immense wealth. Jacob has wealth back home, but he had to give it up for a while in order to go find a wife and to escape his brother. But in their negotiations, Laban is negotiating in bad faith. And he says, okay, I'll give you all of these goats and sheep from my flock, the spotted goats and the solid dark colored sheep. You can have all those from my flock. But then secretly he goes to his sons and says, okay, take all the spotted goats out and all the dark sheep, take them out of the flock. So when Jacob goes over there, there's nothing for him to have. But Jacob has this scheme, he's going to strip bark from these 3 different branches and put them in the water. And the sheep that he wants, the sheep of the goats, he's going to put them, make sure they drink out of these troughs with sticks in it. And somehow they're going to become more fertile and they're going to create spotted goats and dark sheep. Whatever the biological mechanism behind this, I don't think it's really relevant. What's relevant is that God is working through it to make sure that Jacob gets the blessing that God intends for him. Jacob is doing whatever he can to accomplish God's will. He knows that God has promised him that he will be blessed. Before Jacob left the promised land, left Canaan, God said, I will be with you, I will protect you, and I will bring you great blessings, and I'll bring you back again. So Jacob's trusting this. And he's saying, okay, how is God going to bless me through this, even though on the surface, there doesn't appear to be any way for me to get paid in this bad deal? Well, God sends him a dream that says, you can't see it, but the sheep that are standing before the troughs, these are spotted goats and dark colored sheep. And I don't really understand what's happening with the sticks, but this is Jacob's means of trying to make sure that God's blessing happens, and God works through that and actually gives him the blessing that he's looking for. And this connects to the parable of the talents, because the master represents God, and the servants represent, Jacob, Esau, Rachel, Leah, Laban, all of these people. And God gives everybody some skill. He gives everybody a collection of skills, essentially. I mean, everybody's born with certain levels of innate talents, innate abilities. Sometimes they're born into circumstances that give them resources that they can use. And God expects people to use these resources for the benefit of his kingdom. And it's okay to prosper from what God gives you. I mean, there's nothing wrong with accruing wealth, as long as that's not what you're all about. Abraham was wealthy, Jacob, Isaac, all of these patriarchs were wealthy, and that's part of how God used them. So wealth isn't the problem. The problem is why and how. So with the talents, these represent the resources that God gives to each person, and he expects us to use them. God's will be accomplished in the world one way or another. He is going to have his people, and he is going to enact his plan of redemption through Israel, through the Gentiles, and eventually he's going to have this kingdom at the end full of the faithful remnant. It's the thing between here and there that we have to wonder about, because sometimes we look around and we see where are God's people. And like here in Brenham, at least I frequently think I know that there have to be people out there who are asking, the church teaches this about the Sabbath, and the Bible says this, so why aren't we doing that? And looking at the feast days and thinking, why don't we keep these? Why do we keep these man-made things instead of these things that God gave us? Why are all these commands in the Bible that God said this is how his people behave? But the church says we're not supposed to do that. I know that there must be people around here asking those questions, but I don't see them. So I, take my mandrakes and my sticks and put them out there. We have a web page. We've got a Facebook page. Occasionally I run ads on Facebook, and I try to do the best that I can with those things. And I'm obviously no marketing professional, but I don't think Jacob was necessarily a genetics expert, or he may not have really been an expert with flocks either. But God blessed his attempts, even though maybe cutting the bark off of some sticks and putting them in the water didn't really have anything to do with making sure that his sheep and goats bred properly. God made sure that it happened because Jacob was doing the best that he could with what he had. And sometimes it takes a while. Like Rachel was barren for 7 years before she started having children. But she believed that God was going to use her as part of this plan to create a people for Abraham. And so she was patient. And she used whatever resources she had available. And when the time was right for God, he worked through that to create his people through her. And, obviously we have setbacks sometimes. We are in a much smaller group right now than we were 6 months ago. But everything happens in God's time. We have the resources that God intends for us to have, and our job is to use them, even whether it makes sense or not, whether we seem to be the best people. whether we see how God's going to use whatever we can do, that's really not the point. The point is that we take what God has given us and put it to use for his kingdom, and then leave the end result up to him. So God works through all the foibles of people. He worked through the schemes of Jacob and Rebekah, through Leah and Rachel's and Laban's schemes, worked through it all to bless the people, to bless his people, and to find his remnant and bring them together. So that's what I got out of this Torah portion this year. So we want to go back to 29:31 and talk about Torah reading and whatever else there is here.
Yeah, I wondered if anyone, what are the commentaries on the mandrakes? Like, I'm just curious what people say.
I didn't really
I
get
know
into that too much.
Traditionally, they're like a fertility enhancement, but I don't
Just
know.
like, but I mean, like, we know what the mandrakes are, or it's just I hadn't had a chance to really see any commentary on
Jay
it.
said their roots.
Well, a mandrake is a root. Whether that's the real translation of the word is another question. So I'm trying to look that up now.
Yeah. No, it's
Probably
just interesting
truffles.
because then you see Rachel actually conceive after that. You know, so it's like almost an insinuation that
It was maca.
it was maca root.
Well,
Call it
it's a
maca.
Solanaceae, so it's in a nightshade family. This is what's considered as a mandrake. But that would be the same as there's other solaniums, even native here, that we call it horny goat weed.
That actually increases testosterone in men. So
Does it?
Didn't Bill
It's a nightshade.
Cloud say it was a fruit love?
Yeah, the Brown Driver Briggs says that it literally means a love apple.
yeah.
Love apple. Love apple. It's just interesting that she fights for this thing. She's been barren up to this point. She takes, not that the thing is what caused it per se,
Mm-hmm.
but it's almost like she was blessed by pursuing that thing, you know, whether it was actually a fertility, like whether it had that effect or not. And I mean, there's people who like do all sorts of things to try to, you know, improve their fertility, and it works, you know.
Yeah.
I mean, we know God opens and closes the womb too, but it's just, to me, it's kind of interesting that narrative is placed there at that moment where we see that she then actually conceives.
Yeah. I think that whether it's fertility or anything else, that I think that God often waits to bless people to see what they're going to do in the meantime.
Mm-hmm.
Like, how are you going to react to me withholding this blessing from
Right.
you? Are you going to remain faithful and trust that something's going to happen eventually?
Mm-hmm.
Or are you going to get impatient and walk away?
Mm-hmm.
So Rachel
She was
remained
determined.
faithful.
she didn't give up.
Mm-hmm.
I thought it was interesting how, I don't know, Jacob, I have a hard time liking him. And here he is, you know, he's just, despite all the turmoil that Leah and Rachel, you know, that they're having about.
He's like, all right, you want me to go into that one? Okay.
Yeah, and then bring him around.
I gotta go into that one? Okay.
Yeah, and he just, and then, and actually, yeah, seriously, and then, they're like pimping him out, man.
He's not too upset about it, I don't think.
No, he's like, she's like, I bought you today with my son mandrakes, you know. Like,
Yeah. I got to wonder, what is he thinking? He's like, do I have any say in this?
yeah. He's not protesting.
I don't
That's
think,
for sure.
yeah, he does not protest it too much. Although I'm sure it was complicated.
With the strife between
I mean,
two
you think it would be a
sisters.
bit much.
Yeah.
It would make a great miniseries.
Well, you know, I think what's interesting about it is that he was probably just this idea of like him negotiating with Laban. He's probably like every day going out, like working the sheep. He's got stuff to do. He's got all these men. He's, you know, all these responsibilities. but probably every day of his life for many years going, how do I get out of this situation? Like, so he probably did spend a lot more time
I'm thinking he spent a lot of time
alone than with
goats.
them, right?
This is where he comes up with his scheme on the spotted and speckled.
Yeah. He probably was like
Get out of there.
away from the house a lot. Just trying to figure out like what am I going to do to get out of this situation? Like,
But he's
you know?
there. Did we determine whether was he given Rachel at that 7-year mark, or did he wait
At the
7 years
7-year mark. He was given
before he served for Rachel?
right. So he was in debt.
He was
for
in debt
Rachel.
for 7 years.
Yep.
But Rachel didn't bear sons until 7 years after.
Which is interesting.
And it's really Leah was the one that was best suited to be his wife, and traditionally her being the oldest to be married is obvious. And the only reason why he's wanting Rachel is because of her beauty over Leah. You know? But he should have been happy with Leah. You know, honestly.
Yeah, but Laban could have discussed that with him initially. Like, I understand that you like Rachel, but
He would have never
probably
stayed.
left.
He would have left.
So
and I
it was
think
trickery.
that was the whole thing. It was trickery to get him to stay, to get him to work for him, to slave for him, essentially. So he puts him in slavery. But what's interesting too, if you think about it, is that I think God does this with us sometimes, where like he'll put the shiny object in our path, and we're like, I want that thing.
What will you do for that thing?
And then we figure out what it will take to get that thing. And I think it's sort of the same thing. It's like, you're right. I think in a lot of ways, it's like God knew that Leah might be a good wife for him and the person that he needed for a lot of reasons. And I don't understand, the rest of it, but it makes me think about like Jew and Gentile. It makes me think about the bride, and like there's kind of these two parts of that bride, and different characteristics, and like one the chosen and the other one not, and like all this stuff. But really, like the fact that Rachel doesn't conceive until after the 7 years is really interesting, because now she's completely legitimately paid for in that sense. Like he's paid all the debt for her, and now she's having kids for him. And I think that's interesting in a lot of ways, because that it makes me think about the legitimacy of a wife. And there's a couple instances, I think, in scripture. I don't know if it's not, there's one of the other stories that I can't remember now, but it's like the legitimacy of the wife was really important. And it's also important in terms of like paternity, all this stuff. So there's
Sarah and Rebecca both.
Yeah. So there's just a lot about that like I think goes back into some of the patterns around Yeshua and his bride, and all that kind of stuff. So it's interesting.
Bradford pointed out too, just the interesting fact that Leah, though she wasn't favored by Jacob, she's the one that bore Levi and Judah, the priesthood and the kingship, and so the line of Messiah goes through Leah's family, and that's probably not lost on the family tradition.
Yeah.
So it's like, even though there's a favorability that we put on people personally, God's purposes are going to go along the lines of his purpose, even though we may put favor on certain things.
Yeah, same thing with Isaac. Isaac favored
Exactly.
Esau over Jacob,
Right.
but God chose
Exactly.
Jacob.
Exactly.
We don't get to predict God's
Nope.
favor or plan in that way.
Chooses.
Yeah, there is some. I mean, it's hard to tell whether this is God choosing one person and the other person then acts out his role to make sure that happens. How God decided from conception that Jacob was going to be the one to carry Abraham's blessing. But then later Esau acts in a foolish way to make sure that that happens. And Jacob and Rebekah play their role in all that too. But here, God has a plan where he's going to split Abraham's blessing. I mean, all 12 sons are going to participate in that blessing, but 3 of them in particular get specific aspects of it. So Judah has the kingship, Levi has the priesthood, and Joseph has the double blessing.
Right.
But Reuben, who is the actual firstborn, gets skipped over. And, you know, we know why, because he misbehaved in a terrible way later on. But there's this pattern of sons apparently attempting to usurp their father's authority by misbehaving with the father's wife. And there's a big hint that this is the problem with Ham and Noah, is that Ham slept with his own mother and Canaan was the result of that. Bible doesn't say that. So there's, you know, that's some speculation, but there are some literary patterns that point pretty strongly to that possibility. And this happens with David and his sons later.
Yeah.
David's son rebels and sleeps with David's concubines. And this was a way for the new king to assert his authority and say, I am now the king. All that the old king had is now mine. So I think that these sons are playing out this role over time. And there's a good possibility that this was what Reuben was doing, that he was attempting to take the role of the firstborn when he knew that it was not going to be his. That he tried to take it instead of waiting for Jacob to die or for Jacob to give the blessing explicitly to somebody. He's like saying, I know that my relationship with my father is not good. I'm probably not going to get the firstborn blessing. So let me just take it. And so he was probably trying to usurp his father's authority. And this probably goes all the way back to the contest between Leah and Rachel, and Leah being bitter about Rachel having her husband's favor instead of her.
Yeah.
And so she's this thing with the mandrakes. My suspicion is that, you know, the mandrakes wasn't really a big deal. Like, he could always go out in the field and find some more.
Yeah, it seems strange. Like,
so I think,
will you take my son's mandrakes?
Yeah, so I suspect that she's been stewing on something, that she knows the story of Esau and the stew, which that was not an intended pun, but there it is. So take advantage of it. She knows this story. She knows what Rebekah and Jacob did to make sure that Jacob got the blessing. And she knows that this behavior runs through her family. Everybody's a schemer. And she knows that, you know, she and Rachel and Laban schemed to make sure that Leah would be married first. So she's guilty in all this too. And she's thinking, Rachel has my husband's favor. She's scheming to take the firstborn blessing for her own son. I know it. And so when Rachel says, can I have mandrakes from you so that maybe I can have a son for our husband? She's like, oh, you took my husband and now you're going to take my firstborn son's right as the firstborn. I think that's what she's really saying when she's saying, oh, you're going to take my son's mandrakes too. And because her son, she wants to have all the blessings of the firstborn, including the double portion. But the double portion, it implies multiple offspring, because this is the blessing that Joseph gets. His blessing of the double portion is an extension of the blessing of more descendants. Because Ephraim and Manasseh are much bigger tribes, therefore they get a double portion of the territory also.
Is that the first time and only time that was
that kind of split of the blessing?
Double like adoption of grandsons as sons.
Probably.
I don't remember seeing that.
I don't think there's another instance of it in Scripture, but it was probably something that happened on occasion. I don't know. I know obviously the blessing gets scrambled at times. I mean, the firstborn gets passed over frequently in the patriarchs.
Right.
But that's what I think the mandrake thing is all about.
Yeah, that makes sense.
It's very
And Reuben's behavior later goes all the way back to that, in that Leah is bitter about this whole thing, about Rachel being favored, and this bitterness continues over many years, and Reuben picks up on it, and he's going to scheme himself to make sure that he gets that blessing no matter what anybody else says about it. And so he behaves like Esau, and like this is exactly the opposite of how you do it. This isn't going to work, but he does it anyways and ends up losing it permanently.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it does point to, human tendencies in terms of flesh and how we behave in our flesh. And it's like, we know, like, we convince ourselves somehow of these things. So like this could actually work. Kind of like listening to, what's his name this morning, and he's talking about like, there's no way this scheme would ever work. Mm-hmm. And yet she's like, I'll stake my life on it, essentially.
Yeah, with Rebecca and
with
Jacob.
Rebecca and Jacob. And he's like, everybody can see this is like, the risk is way higher than the potential for reward in terms of it working. And I think that's very common in terms of how our flesh behaves. Mm-hmm. It's like we will convince ourselves that something will work outside of God's providence, and we will just like go all in on it. Like, just it's such a common thing for us to do, knowing that like that we cannot force his hand.
Yeah,
we just like it's
that's no something way. That I need to kind of moderate what I said earlier about God recognizes our attempts to accomplish his means and blesses that, as long as you're doing it within the bounds of what he allows.
Right.
If you're going to take it into your own hands and do things that
you're not going to do like a sinful act.
Yeah, you're not going to go out and murder people in order to grow the kingdom of God. God is not going to bless that. He may end up using it, but you're not going to get any reward.
No, David's an example of that.
Well, we see, Jacob wrestling. Like, we see his pursuit of the blessing, and there's times when he's doing it in a way that is not counter to what God would allow. Mm-hmm. I mean, he wrestles with the angel of the Lord. He's like, there were definitely some deceitful behavior, but there was also just a consistent desire for pursuing the blessings that he knew he was going to or should inherit or wanted to inherit. And then we see in this narrative, in this portion, he goes to this special place, and he sees, God shows himself to him and he reiterates this blessing. And so there's like a solidification of what he had been pursuing for so long and probably really didn't even understand.
And then probably doubting at times
what it was, but then to have this solidified in a way that was like, okay, he's like, it's becoming so clear to him really what it is that his purposes are. And God revealing himself in a way that he hadn't seen before. Even though he was pursuing something he didn't really understand, I think.
Yeah.
Or it was less of what he ultimately would see.
Yeah, that's good.
And I'm sure that there are, things in our lives where, you have a desire to pursue something and you may not even really understand like where it's going to head, but there's just something in you have to pursue it,
That's interesting. It really is interesting. Like, I think that like a lot of this stuff, like, why, Jacob, when we read the story about Jacob and his deceit or his manipulation, it's like I think a lot of people want to justify like what he did, but I think that a lot of these stories are really pointing to God's faithfulness despite who we are, despite our inability to do these things on our own, despite our ability to totally screw things up, despite all the ways that we will try to accomplish something that is not within our capabilities. It's like God is like doing these things despite our stupidities and despite our pride, despite like all that kind of stuff, because it is ultimately him that is working to accomplish his purposes, and he's going to work in us and through us a lot of times, but sometimes we're not allowing that, and he's still going to be faithful even when that happens. And that's a really complex sort of thing to try to like tease out, but it plays out over and over again
Well, we see that
in our lives and in scriptures.
we see that as Israel, with Israel as a whole. And God
Yeah.
says it very clearly. I did not choose you because you were the greatest. I didn't choose you because of your character or, oh, these are a righteous people. You know, he's like, no, I chose you because you're the smallest, you're the, you know, stiff-necked people, and I'm going to show myself through you and show my power through you, and I will make you righteous. We're just going to have to watch this whole story unfold for quite some time for that to be revealed, and we're still waiting.
Yeah. But even then, the 7 years and the 7 years is an illustration of that same sort of thing with Israel. Is that like he's building his kingdom, and it takes, you know, Jacob is like, I'm never going to get out of this. Like, I'm going to be in slavery to Laban forever. And that's, I'm sure, what he's feeling. And like, I'm never going to be able to support my family. I'm just going to be under this dude's thumb forever. And in a lot of ways, you know, people who are waiting for the return of Yeshua, it's the same thing. Mm-hmm. We're like, this is never going to happen. Like, when is it going to happen? When is he going to come and make all this right? Because this is crazy stuff, you know?
Yeah. Well, and Bradford was saying,
and it's this long suffering.
Yeah, Bradford was saying that this was not a common practice at that time in terms of like selling yourself to get a wife.
Yeah, well, and also
like you think about it, if it was normal, like, oh yeah, I got to work for you for 7 years for that.
Exactly.
Wife. Okay, everyone's used to it.
I think
this is what we do.
Leah and Rachel didn't want to be sold either.
Exactly.
I mean, they wanted to be brides, but you know,
so it was all unusual in that.
Well, they even say that later on in the next chapter.
Right.
They're like, our dad sold us. Like,
yeah,
right.
It's complicated because I mean, the normal thing would be the prospective husband brings a bride price.
like
The father gives
Yeah.
a dowry in return, so there's an exchange of gifts. And the bride price would usually be higher than the dowry, but not necessarily. In this case, there's a bride price and no dowry. So Laban is essentially selling his daughters as concubines. But God has other plans. So God extracts the dowry from Laban against his will and pays Rachel and Leah's bride price, or pays their dowry on Laban's behalf. At his expense too, of course.
That also really points to that idea that when Rachel starts having children, they are legitimately, they're legitimately wives. They're full heirs. You know, so that's a really interesting aspect too, from a legal standpoint in the culture. But yeah, I forgot about that. That was the whole God extracting the dowry.
You know, we have speculated in the past, like, what's going on with these trees, these 3 branches, and are they actually playing a role? Or is God just using this for some other purpose? And I don't, it looks like Jacob is performing some kind of magic ritual. And I don't, if that was the case, the scriptures would just say, and Jacob did this stupid magic thing and that didn't do anything, but God blessed him anyways. I suspect that's what he would say. And so there's another reason that these trees are mentioned.
I wonder if they made the water like sweet or something.
That's exactly what I was about to say. Because when
he's birchwood or whatever, it's sweet.
It's sweet because it has xylitol, right? That's where xylitol comes from. That's one of the sources. And that's exactly what I was about to say, is that it just says that when the ones he didn't want to mate with them came, he didn't put it in the water. And so that makes me think that the water was sweet. Mm-hmm. And that, or whatever they wanted, whatever
I could imagine
cows and sheep and goats, whatever.
The animals are all alike. You want something sweet.
They're attracted. Whatever they were attracted to was why he was doing it. So I don't think it had anything to do with the fertility, although, if it had some nutritional value in terms of sweetness, maybe there was.
It sounded to me more like an attractant.
It really is more about an attractant. That's what I think. So it wasn't really about. It was trying to get them near the troughs.
And then
where
when they're
the
together,
women
we
and
know
where
what they're
the
gonna do.
females in heat were, right? And get them to the right place. So he was just luring them to the right place, I think. And there's nothing wrong with that. Like,
I suspect that
Seems
God is trying to
legitimate.
tell us something else through the specific trees, but I can only guess.
well, there
as to what.
might be something to that, but either way, it does seem like there wasn't any necessary magical effect from the trees themselves. He was just using it to attract the animals he wanted to attract, and then not using it when he didn't want to attract some of them.
Well, I get the sense too that he's a pretty shrewd.
Oh yeah.
What do you call it? Husbandryman,
Mm-hmm.
and that he had observed these animals and knew
Right.
their behaviors, and he was smart about it. Laban probably didn't have. I mean, I feel like Jacob probably had just really good skill in that area, and he was smart.
They prospered. I mean,
He
it's
was smart.
all
Yeah.
God's property.
And
That's
he
gotta
knew
be
how
true.
to manage it, and God used that for his purposes, I think. But I don't know. That's my thought. Is I always think of that story in the way that it's told, in just demonstrating that it was good. He was a good animal husbandry observer of how to manage
But the
that.
purpose of all this was genetically to come up with the tribes.
Right.
And I think it's interesting earlier in Jacob's dream about the ladder sounds, you know what DNA looks like? Looks like a ladder, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know, and that's what he was promising him in the dream too, that your descendants, you know. And so that's all interesting. But now I think there is something about him attracting them to, because that was breeding ground, so he wanted them to stay there and be attracted there, so he was
Yeah, I
didn't
think
want
he
to breed the weak ones.
knew what he was doing.
Well,
He was being
what it-
purposeful.
What it reads like is that he gave them all a taste, like he gave all the flocks a taste of what that water with the branches tasted like. And then eventually he removed it for when the ones that he didn't want were around. And so then when he put it in when the strong flocks were around, then they mated,
Right.
and it really was to
I mean,
his
that's
advantage.
good
And it
animal
seems-
husbandry is what I say.
yeah, it is. And I think, like, I mean, without any other modern breeding techniques, like, he was selecting for the genetics. So it's interesting. He was selecting for the genetics of the flock, and God was selecting for the genetics of Israel itself.
Yeah.
And so it's like it's competition on both ends, but also God's selection of the genetics.
Well,
It's really
and
interesting.
Also, Jacob asks the Lord to provide for him food and sustenance, and are you going to take care of me? And we know throughout the scriptures that having good, healthy flocks, a good herd of various animals is a part of God's blessing, and knowing that you'll have food for he's got all these people to feed.
Yeah, not just his
all
children.
these mouths to feed, so it's like also just that.
The sheep do more. They're both food and clothing.
Yeah, but I mean, it's a part of knowing that you're provided for. You have healthy flock. You have what you need to take care of your 12 sons plus the 4 ladies plus all everything. It's a lot to
workers.
take care of.
Yep.
And then he's gonna move on.
Yep.
So.
Yeah. And now he's going to have something. He's not going to be in debt anymore. So he's out of debt before this happens. Like, he's paid off all the debt, and now he's like, now I'm going to build wealth. It's like totally Dave Ramsey.
So Dave Ramsey.
I'm kidding. But he's doing it in order in that sense. Like, he's building something now that he's not in debt. Now that he's not in slavery or debt. And this is like even according to God's law and the stuff he lays down later in the scriptures is like, how to restore people, how to make them productive and good members of society. And here he is, he's like going through the same process himself. And in a lot of ways, it's reflective of the process we go through in going from being enslaved to sin to not being enslaved to sin, and then to also building the kingdom through using our talents
Mhm.
and, helping others enter the kingdom.